Brussels, a winter night in 1909. A cold wind hisses through the halls of the royal palace. The gas lights flicker against velvet drapes and golden frames. But in the heart of the palace, darkness clings like guilt. In a bed carved of ivory, wrapped in furs too heavy for breath, King Leopold II lies dying. The nurses speak in whispers. The priests wait outside the door. But inside his head, there is no silence. He hears them again. They cut through jungle and humanity alike, for rubber, for ivory, for wealth that never touched African soil but built palaces, railroads, and monuments in his name. Screams, whispers in Lingala, children sobbing, the snap of a whip, a mother crying for a child whose tiny hand was severed. That everything he built was fertilized by blood, that every coin bore the weight of a hand, that even a king cannot command silence when history screams. He called it the Congo Free State, a lie etched into history. It was never free. It was his private slaughterhouse. The thud of rubber sacks tossed onto counting tables, the rhythm of machetes, the rhythm of the jungle twisted into a rhythm of death. He once ruled a kingdom no map acknowledged, not Belgium, but deeper, wilder, there, in a land tens of thousands of kilometers away. He had sent agents, soldiers, priests, and monsters, and it calls him now, not as king, but as father, the father of a nation of corpses. But death has no empire, and now, in these final hours, the ghosts have returned, not in protest, not in revenge, but in reminder. Outside, the Belgian flag still flutters quietly. Inside, the king coughs. His beard is yellowed. His fingernails are dark, the last monarch of a dying century. He clutches at his blankets as if they can shield him from memory. But Congo is not a memory. Congo is alive. It breathes in the twisted forests. It drips from the red rivers. He will die unloved. He will die condemned. But most tragically, he will die aware. Welcome to Silent Chronicles. Tonight, we open the gates to Leopold's kingdom of horror, and we walk with him, one last time, through the halls of power, into the jungle of guilt. If history remembers kings by their monuments, then Leopold II built his from bones. This is not a story of war or conquest. It is a story of silence, complicity, and a nation built on amputated limbs. Subscribe to Silent Chronicles and follow us as we unravel the darkest corners of royalty, where polished crowns hide unspeakable crimes. Leopold II was not born a monster. He was born in Brussels in 1835, the son of King Leopold I, the first monarch of a newly independent Belgium, a country carved awkwardly from the leftovers of European power struggles. From the beginning, young Leopold felt caged. His father was cold, the court was rigid, and the crown he was born into was, in his eyes, small. Belgium, for all its cathedrals and parliaments, was a minor player in a major age. Britain had India, France had Algeria, the Dutch ruled the East Indies, and Belgium had lace. The parliament would not fund colonial adventures. The nation was too small, too cautious, and so Leopold looked beyond his own people to Africa, where maps were still filled with blank spaces, and where European powers were racing to draw their flags across lands they had never seen. That was not enough for Leopold. Under the guise of treaties, most of which the local chiefs could not read, he laid legal claim to millions of lives. He was tall, well-dressed, with a thick beard and piercing eyes that made him look every inch the archetype of a European sovereign. But behind the grand facade, his ambitions burned far larger than the borders of his kingdom. In Belgium, Leopold was celebrated as a visionary. He used his profits to beautify Brussels, building parks, museums, triumphal arches. The press called him a humanitarian. School children learned of his courage. He walked through gilded corridors while, thousands of miles away, men, women, and children were whipped for failing to meet rubber quotas. He wanted not just to reign, but to possess. Villages were given quotas of rubber to collect from wild vines deep in the forest. If they failed, they were punished, not just with death, but with something even more chilling: the severing of hands. A grotesque form of accounting. Each bullet used by the Force Publique, Leopold's private army, had to be justified by a severed hand. And somewhere deep in his sleep, the jungle began to speak. It was meant to prevent waste. Instead, it became a currency of terror, not merely to govern, but to etch his name into the land, to build an empire that would outlive him, and prove that Belgium, through him, was no less glorious than the empires of old. He read numbers, not screams. He attended operas and state banquets. A man whose crimes bled across oceans and generations. A monarch who shaped the 20th century not with laws, but with scars. He posed for portraits while children in Congo cried over the bodies of their mutilated parents. But there was a problem. Belgium, as a constitutional monarchy, limited his powers. In 1876, he convened a conference in Brussels under the noble-sounding title, the International African Association. He framed it as a humanitarian effort to bring civilization, Christianity, and commerce to the heart of Africa. Missionaries spoke out. A few brave journalists published damning accounts. The writer Mark Twain called it the vilest scramble for loot that ever disfigured the history of human conscience. But the Belgian crown remained untouched. Leopold was still the great philanthropist in the public eye. He spoke of roads, hospitals, missions. He used the language of light, of duty, of uplift, and the world believed him. It would not be a colony of Belgium, bound by Parliament. No, it would be his, a private state owned personally by the king, a business masquerading as a nation. But behind closed doors, Leopold had no intention of saving anyone. He saw Congo, a vast, uncharted territory the size of Western Europe, not as a place, but as property. By the time the Berlin Conference of 1884–85 legitimized Leopold's claim to the Congo Basin, the king had already begun assembling his machinery: mercenaries, explorers, accountants, and missionaries. And in 1885, the Congo Free State was born. On paper, it was a utopian project. In reality, it was a slave empire, one of the most brutal in modern history. But few in Europe knew this. The system was efficient. The king never saw this firsthand. He didn't need to. He received reports, sanitized and balanced in profit margins. He believed he was building legacy. He was, in truth, building a graveyard. As the 19th century drew to a close, whispers began to emerge. And yet, as he aged, as his beard grayed and his children died young, something began to crack. He withdrew further into his palace. He surrounded himself with teenage mistresses. He banned mention of Congo in his presence, not in words, but in moans, not in accusations, but in presence. For a man who believed he had created something eternal, Leopold was now haunted by something equally immortal: the memory of pain. This is the man we now follow, not merely as a king, but as a soul on trial. The jungle had no calendar. In Congo, time was not counted in hours or days. It was counted in how many baskets of rubber you brought and how many hands were taken when you failed. To Leopold II, these were figures in a ledger: pounds harvested, villages pacified, taxes collected. But for those who lived beneath his shadow, the Congo Free State was a slow crucifixion, a land where survival was an act of submission and rebellion meant extinction. The king never needed to lift a weapon. Recruited from other parts of Africa and led by European officers, these soldiers turned the Congo into an open-air prison. Children were tortured to motivate their fathers, and always the hands. Their orders were simple: extract rubber at any cost, and the cost was always human. He had an army to do that for him. The Force Publique, a mercenary army armed with rifles, whips, and quotas, became the executioners of Leopold's economic vision. Villages were burned to set examples. Women were taken hostage to force the men into the forest. But what began as accounting became ritualized horror. Whole baskets of hands were collected from the innocent, infants, elders. Sometimes the body was left alive, crippled, mangled, humiliated. Modern and utterly conscious hands became the currency of fear. If a soldier wasted a bullet, he had to provide a severed hand to prove it wasn't used on game. Not in a war, not in famine, but in commerce. Genocide disguised as entrepreneurship. And somewhere in Brussels, Leopold counted the profit. Whispers escape. Missionaries smuggled out photos, grainy, black and white portraits of children with no arms, women with empty sleeves, men staring into the camera with hollow, endless eyes. Between 1885 and 1908, it's estimated that 10 million people died in the Congo Free State. Every ship leaving Belgium for Congo carried weapons and chains, and every ship returning carried rubber and ivory, but no goods of trade, no payment. For the first time, Europe looked at itself and saw the monster in the mirror. Only plunder, only silence. He dismissed the corpses as exaggerations, but behind the outrage, there was a quiet fear that history might remember him not as a builder but as a butcher. But perhaps the most haunting part of this machine was its efficiency. The cruelty wasn't chaotic, it was systemic. There were ledgers, warehouses, timetables. The terror was industrial. He hosted monarchs in halls gilded with Congo gold. His beard, long and regal, became the symbol of Belgian power. He built seaside palaces and garden estates. He was known as the Builder King. Schoolbooks praise his civilizing mission. He began isolating himself, even from his own family. His beloved son died at age 9. His marriage was cold. Even in retreat, the land was not freed. But Leopold had lost his private empire. He spent his twilight years surrounded not by advisors, but by underage mistresses, a grotesque attempt to cling to vitality as his body withered. And the man at the top, who never rose, who simply obeyed until they vanished. It was as if Belgium itself had conspired to bury him while he still breathed, sometimes stopping to stare at statues of angels, then turning away, as if ashamed. He was celebrated, the beat of the jungle, the rustle of vines, the rusted chains. Leopold received medals. No one dared mention the truth, and perhaps, for a while, he believed the lie too. But the jungle never forgot. As Leopold aged, his empire began to rot from within. One voice rose louder than others: Edmund Dean Morel, a British shipping clerk who noticed a chilling pattern. Morel began publishing. Others followed. Activists like Roger Casement and Mark Twain joined the campaign, and Leopold began to feel the cracks. He grew paranoid. He lashed out at reporters. He called the photographs fake, the missionaries liars. Inside his palaces, the mirrors were polished, but in his mind, they shattered. He forbade discussion of Congo in court, but in the dead of night, servants said they heard him walking alone through the halls, muttering, mumbling, holding papers. What does guilt look like in a man with no conscience? It looks like silence where once there was power. It looks like golden halls echoing with footsteps only he hears. It looks like a king haunted not by rebellion but by compliance. The millions who never spoke. By 1908, the global outcry reached such heights that Leopold was forced to relinquish the Congo Free State not to its people, but to the Belgian government. He sold it like a business. And then, he began to die slowly, privately, in silence. He stopped attending ceremonies. His meals were taken alone. The fountains he once built ran dry. Even his courtiers stopped speaking his name with reverence. But he was not alone, naturally, because in the final months, when the curtains were drawn and the fire burned low, he claimed he could hear drums. He would stare into the fire and whisper in French, "Ils n'oublient pas." They do not forget, and they didn't. By 1909, King Leopold II was a man reduced to quarters. His footsteps echoed through the empty marble halls of Laeken Palace, slower now, dragging. His body once upright and statuesque was curling inward, as if even his spine had begun to recoil from the weight of what he had done. Public demonstrations erupted across Europe. Pamphlets flooded the streets. His statues were vandalized with red paint, mockingly labeled the king of rubber and blood. No longer a sovereign of ambition, he was a relic, a living monument to crimes too vast for even time to digest. The newspapers had turned. Where once they hailed him as the Builder King, now they called him the Butcher of Africa. Crowds booed his carriage. Children mocked his figure. Parliamentarians whispered of madness, of shame, of a king who must not be honored in death. He would sit before it, staring. Behind him, oil portraits lined the walls, painted in better years, with more flattering brush strokes. In one, he stood with globe in hand. In another, he sat on a throne of lambskin. But he never turned to look at them now. But perhaps the cruelest judgment came from within Belgium itself. The very people he claimed to elevate with Congo's wealth now despise him. Still, he clung to ceremony. He clung to routine. He would wake soaked in sweat, heart pounding, clutching at his chest as if he'd been dragged underwater. He'd hear whispers in unfamiliar tongues, then screams always distant, always echoing. Sometimes he'd smell smoke, or rubber, or blood. Every evening, servants lit a fire in his chamber, not by servants, but by the king himself. He no longer recognized the man in the paintings. The king's refusal to express repentance became a scandal. He rejected confession. He avoided priests. He banned any mention of missionaries. To him, repentance was surrender, and Leopold had never known surrender, not to man, not to God, and the mirror once polished daily was draped in cloth. He gifted her diamonds, titles, lands all paid for with Congo's agony. Even as he decayed, he sought possession, as if claiming new flesh might silence the old ghosts. She said the king talked to shadows, that he held out his hand in the night, reaching for something not there. That sometimes, in sleep, he'd beg in languages she didn't understand. The jungle entered his lungs. The drums lived in his heartbeat. It began with the dreams. He was fading, and no one, not a single subject wept for him outside the gates. There was no public prayer, no vigil. He'd ask his valet, or Kikongo. Behind him, the throne is grand, but he does not sit like a king. He sits like a man awaiting trial. His daughters did not come. His mistresses stayed in separate rooms. The royal staff walked carefully, afraid to speak above a whisper, or the tongue of a dying child. Do you hear that? But the truth seeped through. This was not the death of a monarch, it was the burial of a crime. The man would say, "No, sire, the horror didn't end with him, but he was the architect, the father, the one who looked at a map and saw not people, but prophet." But Leopold would whisper, "They're here," in the hours between dusk and dawn. He became a prisoner not of Belgium, but of Congo. It arrived uninvited, in dreams, in shadows, in silence, literally. In one of the most chilling acts of passive rebellion, the crowd lining the road stood in silence, facing away from the coffin. By this point, even the church had grown uneasy. He thought he had conquered Africa, but Africa had marked him. In every dream, in every silence, in every hand he never saw, but somehow still felt pressing against his chest. But guilt is not a thing you answer to. Guilt simply is. He tried to drown it. He surrounded himself with young girls, barely 16, including Caroline Lacroix, his final mistress. It didn't. In his final months, Caroline began to avoid his room, not French, not Flemish, but perhaps in Lingala. His last official portrait, painted in 1908, shows him seated but not triumphant. His beard is unkempt, his eyes hollow. In December 1909, pneumonia took hold. The palace doctors did what they could, but they knew his deathbed was lined with opulence, but empty of affection. And the king, who once commanded an empire of terror, could command nothing now, not even his own sleep. On December 17, 1909, Leopold II died. But the silence that followed was not respectful. It was accusation. as his body was driven through the streets of Brussels for his funeral procession. The people turned their backs. A nation had judged its king, and they judged him guilty. The palace tried to spin it. Newspapers printed polite obituaries. The church offered sanitized eulogies. And what of the Congo? Leopold left it to the Belgian state, stripped of its name, its soul, and nearly half its population. He died in bed, warm, fed, titled. But he died alone, and worse, he died remembering. The jungle had devoured him, not his body, but his mind. This is not a story of justice. It is a story of rot, of how power unchecked does not simply corrupt, it hollows. And when there is nothing left inside the crown but bone, even kings begin to bleed. At the heart of the tragedy lies a question that still echoes. How did one man buy a nation? Not conquer it, not inherit it, not be elected to lead it. It was a private enterprise, a legal fiction, constructed by Leopold II to bypass parliaments, morality, and accountability. In the language of the 19th century, this was innovation. It wore the face of civilization, spoke the language of philanthropy, and moved with the precision of accounting. It built no parliaments, no democracies, only quotas, roads for export, and gallows. In the language of humanity, it was enslavement on an industrial scale, but buy it as if it were a parcel of land, a machine, a piece of furniture. The Congo Free State was not a colony. It was not an extension of the Belgian crown. For the first time in modern history, a head of state became a CEO of horror. Leopold's Congo marked the convergence of two forces: the respectability of European royalty and the ruthlessness of capitalist expansion. It called itself a mission. It was a machine. The tragedy of Leopold is not that he was exceptional. The scramble for Africa turned ancient civilizations into bargaining chips. European powers gathered in boardrooms and parlors to divide entire continents with pens and rulers. The rise of bicycles, automobiles, telegraphs, every strand of modern life was wrapped in the need for pliable, stretchable material. Congo had it in abundance, and more importantly, Congo had no power to say no. No African voice was present. No consent was required. It's that he was logical and natural result of the age that birthed him. The late 19th century was a time when maps were being redrawn in smoke and greed. In this context, Leopold simply played the game more efficiently. He did not pretend to rule for the people. He ruled for profit, and the world let him. Because the Congo gave Europe what it wanted: rubber. At the time, rubber was gold. The laborers were not workers, they were hostages. The currency was not money, it was flesh. The contract was not voluntary, it was violence. And it worked. The profits rolled in. Leopold built monuments. The Belgian economy thrived. Meanwhile, entire cultures were annihilated, entire regions depopulated. Children grew up knowing only two things: the jungle and the whip. The infrastructure built during Leopold's reign, the railroads, depots, forced labor systems became the foundation of a modern colonial state. It was reformed by rebranding, and yet, when the truth began to surface, the world acted shocked. Outrage poured in. Petitions were signed. Commissions were launched. But what was truly shocking was not the savagery, it was that it had been so visible, so documented, so tolerated for so long. Its soil contains the materials that power our smartphones, our laptops, our electric cars. Because the problem was never just Leopold. It was the system that allowed him to exist, the polite conferences, the diplomatic silence, the kingly prestige. How empires hide behind paperwork. How evil wears gloves and speaks Latin. Evil did not come dressed as a demon. It came in satin sashes, speaking French, and writing charters of civilization. This is the hardest truth of all. Leopold did not create the Congo Free State against the world's will. He created it with its permission, and when he died, nothing fundamental changed. The Congo was handed over to the Belgian government, which continued to exploit it less brazenly, but no less destructively. Even after independence in 1960, Congo's suffering did not end. Civil wars, coups, dictatorships, foreign interference, ghosts of a past never exorcised. Today, the Democratic Republic of Congo remains one of the most resource-rich yet politically unstable nations on earth. And once again, the people are poor. And once again, we look away. The story of Leopold II is not just a cautionary tale of monarchy run wild. It is a mirror reflecting how civilization justifies atrocity when profit is at stake. Even now, debates rage in Belgium. Should statues of Leopold be removed? Should school children learn the real history? Should there be reparations? But these questions, though valid, are small compared to the deeper wound. Because history is not just about who killed or who ruled. It's about who was allowed to matter. And for millions in the Congo, their lives were never written down. They left no names, no diaries, no portraits, only echoes. Only the sound of the whip, the rustle of vines, and the soft click of ivory typewriters in Brussels recording the monthly quotas. Leopold wanted to be remembered, and he is. But not as he hoped, not as a builder, not as a father of his nation, but as a warning that when morality is drowned by economy, when sovereignty is sold like sugar or steel, when the world values rubber more than children, then there are no kings, only executioners and crowns. Somewhere deep in the Congolese jungle, there are trees older than any kingdom. Their roots run through soil watered by forgotten names. Their bark still scars where whips once struck. Their leaves still tremble when the wind remembers. And beneath them, silence grows, not the peace of rest, but the hush of things never spoken, graves never marked, lives never counted. Leopold II left no heir worthy of his legacy, only ghosts. They say history is written by the victors, but this history was written in missing limbs. It was etched into bone, not paper. It was passed on not through monuments, but through wounds carried by generations. In Brussels, his statue still stands, some vandalized, some defended. In Congo, the air still carries his name, but only in mourning. He ruled a land he never touched, but it touched him in return quietly, completely, eternally. Because there is no grave deep enough to hold 10 million voices, and no crown heavy enough to crush a memory that bleeds. In the end, he died rich, but not remembered. He died royal, but not mourned. He died human, but not forgiven. So when you next see a gilded name carved on a wall, framed in gold, ask what was buried beneath it. Ask who paid for it. Ask who bled for it. Because every empire leaves footprints, and some of them are made of hands.